This is the lecture for temperature, humidity, and water movement in the greenhouse, as created and narrated by Miles Gennard. Today we're going to start with the SPAC, or the Soil Plant Atmosphere Continuum, followed by temperature and how it relates to water movement in plants, moving on to relative humidity, vapor pressure deficit, boundary layer, and then a little bit about water use efficiency and transpiration rate. So moving into the Soil Plant Atmosphere Continuum, or SPAC for short, this is a list of the water movement through the plant. I'll give you a minute to take a look at this, but I'm really going to go ahead and narrate what happens on the next slide. So here I've created a little visual for you, just to point a couple of things out. The sun is the driving force of this system. It's in its creation of heat. And then if you look, I don't know if the pointer is going to work, but over here around the leaf, this is going to be the boundary layer of the leaf, which I'll talk about a little bit in this section and then a little bit later, as we saw. Understanding the SPAC is fairly simple at its most basic level. The cycle begins when water molecules are absorbed from the soil by the root hairs of the plant. The water molecules travel through the root hairs to larger roots and eventually make it to the stem. The water travels through the stem's vascular tissue, xylem, and eventually makes its way to the leaves. In the leaves, the water is utilized in photosynthesis and converted into molecular oxygen and water vapor. The water content of the air inside the leaf is ideally close to saturation to keep the cells turgid and functioning properly. When the stomata are open, water vapor will escape from the leaves and enter into the leaf boundary layer and eventually into the bulk atmosphere. The cycle will begin again when water is reintroduced into the soil or substrate. Moving on to temperature. Temperature is important for maintaining proper plant growth and development. Media temperature and air temperature can be important for the different stages of a plant's development. For example, media temperature is more important during propagation for root development, and air temperature is more important for top growth. Typical temperatures for propagation for air range from 70 to 72 during the day and 65 to 68 during the night. For media, you want 75 to 80 degrees Fahrenheit for day and night. Typical temperatures for bedding crops include air temperature of 62 to 64 on cloudy days and 68 to 70 on sunny days, and the media should be around 60 to 62. So how do we maintain media temperature? As you can see in this image, heat lines below the bench or in the floor when the crop is grown on the floor pump warm water through them to maintain a temperature from below. You can also use heating pads or tubes directly underneath the pot. Here we see in the top image with the poinsettias, there are warm water tubes directly under the pot on top of the bench. Right next to that, the warm water lines are right underneath the mesh of the bench. And the last image, the warm water lines are run through the gravel on the floor to maintain a constant bottom temperature. Next up is controlling air temperature. When considering heating, the primary source comes directly from the sun. Steam, which is a radiator type system, can also be used for supplemental heating. It is considered central heating because the heating source is off-site and the steam is pumped into the rooms that need the heat the most. Sometimes the system can be more cost-effective, but can be a burden to control when turning on and turning off the system and powering it up and powering it down. Gas heating is another option. It's considered local heating because the heating source is located directly in the room where the plants are being grown. However, this type of heating can excessively dry the air and potentially cause problems with gas leaks and incomplete burns with ethylene gas, which will cause weird things to happen with your plants that you don't want to happen. Infrared lamps, which are also local heating because the lamps are in the same room as the plants, is also another option. This method is cost-effective but difficult to measure because infrared does not directly heat the air. Rather, it heats the surface of an object that it strikes. When considering sensors, you want to make sure that the sensor is as close to the plant canopy as possible. Also, that it's not in direct sunlight so that it does not get a warming effect directly from the sun, and that it's in the media when bottom heat is used. Most commonly, an aspirated box is used. The box protects the sensor from the direct sun and also blows a constant stream of air over the sensor to give a more accurate reading of the bulk air temperature. Next up in controlling air temperature is cooling. There are two ways to control cooling. First off is passive, which utilizes windows, vents, and curtain walls to cool the air, and next is active or mechanical, with the use of fans to pull the air through the greenhouse. Starting off with passive, you can open the air vents at the top or the ridge vents of the greenhouse to allow hot air to escape. The side vents will allow cooler air to come in from the outside, and even when there's no breeze outside, the air in the greenhouse will still circulate on a sunny day due to the buoyancy effect of warm air, or the fact that warm air rises. As the warm air rises, cool air will be pulled in from the sides. So with passive cooling, in the photo on the left, you can see that the ridge vents at the top of the greenhouse are open so that hot air can escape. In the photo on the top right, the side vents, which don't include fans in this case, are open so that cooler air can flow in as the warm air flows out through the ridge vents. The photo below that shows a box in the middle of the image with the label Argus. That's an example of an aspirated box which was discussed previously. So moving on to some active cooling. As mentioned, active cooling involves mechanical energy. Often, evaporative cooling pads are used in conjunction with fans to increase the amount of cooling. The system includes water trickling down the evaporative pads and effectively cooling the air as it passes through. Shading systems can also help by reducing the amount of radiant energy that's entering into the greenhouse to warm it up. This slide illustrates evaporative cooling pads. The top image actually shows the pad. If you can imagine, the pad is more of like a mesh of material that allows water to trickle down through as air passes through. The exhaust fans in the bottom image are responsible for sucking the air in through the ridge vents, through the corridor, and through the evaporative pads to allow the cool air to penetrate into the greenhouse. Next up, we're going to dive into relative humidity. Relative humidity is a relative comparison of the amount of water held in the atmosphere at a given temperature to the maximum amount of water that the air can hold at the same temperature. 100% relative humidity means that the air is fully saturated and very close to dew point for the given temperature. 100% relative humidity does not mean that it's raining already or that you're underwater. It just means that the air is completely saturated with water and is very close to the dew or condensation point. If the dew point is met, condensation or precipitation will occur. With relative humidity, the warmer the air, the more energetic the molecules are and further away from each other they are at a given time. This means that more water vapor can be held in the air. If the temperature of the air increases and the water content remains the same, then the relative humidity will decrease. This slide kind of illustrates that last point. If you can imagine the temperature as a volume of air, 25 degrees Celsius will be a larger volume than 20 degrees Celsius. You can see that both temperatures have the same amount of water molecules in their cylinders. There is, however, a difference in the relative humidity. At 25 degrees with the same amount of water content, there is only 40% relative humidity, versus at 20 degrees, there's a higher percent, 70, a relative humidity. Some sensors for irrigation rely on relative humidity as an indicator for when watering is needed. The thought is that the lower the relative humidity, the drier the air is, and the more likely that plants will need watered. In reality, relative humidity is a relative measure based on temperature and does not give the most precise picture on the water content of the air. These systems are, however, in most cases better than a simple time system, which will distribute water regardless of the plant's need for it. Next up is vapor pressure deficit, or VPD. This is another measure used to determine the amount of water vapor present in the atmosphere. Vapor pressure is a measure of the amount of water vapor in the air at a given temperature. Vapor pressure saturation, or VP-SAP, is the maximum amount of water vapor that the air can hold at a given temperature. The vapor pressure deficit is the difference in how much water vapor is actually in the air and how much the air can hold when saturated. The vapor pressure deficit influences the condensation potential and transpiration rate due to evaporative demand. So first of all, the condensation potential becomes greater when the VPD reaches 0. VPD starts at 0, meaning that there's no vapor pressure deficit and increases from there. The transpiration rate increases as the VPD increases because the air is drier. The same is true for the evaporative demand, meaning that the potential for water vapor to be absorbed by the air is greater as the VPD increases. The vapor pressure deficit is more accurate than relative humidity, as it gives an absolute measure rather than a relative measure of the amount of water vapor that is currently in the air. In this slide, you see an illustration of vapor pressure deficit and its effect on transpiration from leaves. The higher the vapor pressure deficit, meaning that more water vapor can enter in the air, means that higher transpiration will occur. When this happens, plants can dry out and they will need to be watered. When the vapor pressure deficit is lower, the transpiration rate will also be lower, and the plants will less likely need to be watered. If moisture builds up on plant surfaces, it can cause disease problems. Irrigation systems that rely on vapor pressure deficit as an indicator of when to water are much more accurate than those that use relative humidity or those that use timers. That brings us to the boundary layer of the leaves. The boundary layer is a thin layer of lower relative humidity, lower vapor pressure deficit, and higher water content surrounding the leaf in relation to the bulk air. The boundary layer can be imagined as a thin envelope of air with higher water content that directly surrounds the leaf. The warm leaf causes the air to also warm and affects the vapor pressure deficit and the relative humidity. The layer acts as a buffer between the air spaces in the leaf and the bulk air. The boundary layer is a very delicate system and is only effective in still air. If the air is not still, the wind is likely to blow the boundary layer away from the leaf. This slide illustrates the origin of the boundary layer resistance. As you can see, the leaf temperature is at 25 degrees and the boundary layer is also at 25 degrees. This is because of the radiant energy from the sun striking the leaf and warming it up and warming the air directly outside of the leaf. The bulk air is 20 degrees. As mentioned before, with relative humidity, air with a higher temperature can hold more water. This means that the boundary layer may act as a buffer to the water vapor that's escaping from the leaf and out into the atmosphere. An effective boundary layer will slow the transpiration rate and increase the water use efficiency of a plant. So now I'm going to wrap up with these two terms, which I've already thrown around a little bit: water use efficiency and transpiration rate. Both can be utilized to calculate how much water is used to produce dry matter. Dry matter is measured by taking the weight of a completely desiccated plant. As a grower, it's likely not used when growing ornamental crops, but can still provide a good measure on water practices for the same crop in the future. This slide just illustrates the way that water use efficiency and transpiration rate are calculated. That concludes our lecture on plant and water relations in the greenhouse. If you have any questions, please direct them to me, Miles Gennard, at gennard.14@osu.edu. Thank you.